Okay, so we are recording. So I would like to say hello to everyone and thank you all for coming. And we have two speakers today, so we're going to have two speakers presenting. And I'm really excited to introduce them. They are both from the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And they are the horticulturalists that manage the landscape. So Joseph Charup is the director of horticulture and the curator, and Sarah Evans is the manager of horticulture operations and projects. And they are going to talk to us today about how they have been managing the landscape and sort of changing how they manage the landscape for a variety of reasons that I will let them describe to you. But it's super interesting, and I think you will enjoy it. And so I'm going to turn it right over to them.
Good evening, everyone. I can't guarantee this is going to be super interesting, but I hope it is. So I'm
I'm going to guarantee it. I think it's very interesting.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here tonight, joined by my partner in crime, Sarah Evans, and we are going to talk to you a little bit about the history of Greenwood and the history of the movement that helped Greenwood evolve and where we are today. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So the title of our talk is The Modern Rural Cemetery, the Challenges and Opportunities of Managing a Historic Landmark. And so let me minimize this, put this here. So a little we're going to do a lot of background tonight, but just to kick off, it's a privilege to be able to talk about a 200-year-old institution that's continually evolving today. Throughout its history, its landscape has been shaped by major trends in cemetery design, public policy, cultural changes, and attitudes towards death. But many of the challenges and opportunities we face today are informed by historic landscape practices and the different periods of time that informed what cemetery stewards conducted with the land. But prior to getting to Greenwood, it's important to set the context of a little bit of history about where Greenwood came from. And to do that, we should look first at Grove Street Cemetery, established in 1796, also known as the New Haven Burial Ground. So this cemetery was not a direct inspiration for Greenwood, but it was important because it became the first cemetery in the world to be incorporated as a private, not-for-profit, non-sectarian institution. It was founded by a guy named James Hillhouse, who was a wealthy New Havenite who wanted to move burial grounds from the backyards and churchyards to a designated area. Change was happening here. This was a new movement, and but the landscape really wasn't what we see later. So this is the earliest example of cemetery as distinct and planned landscape. There are plantings, there's a road system, there's street signs, and they're permanent monuments. And what we'll see as a continual trend throughout this process is that the landscape was laid out not by a landscape professional, even though landscape architecture was not yet a career, but it was laid out by a math professor. So it was very gridded, perhaps as a result. But it did mark a moment in time in which cemeteries became not-for-profit, non-sectarian.
I do want to interject real quick, Joe. In some of the research we did, I found that Grove Street Cemetery, so, it's coming from a person who is of like a secular background designing a sacred space. And this archway the intent behind it was to make it look very old. So I forget the scripture on it, but it's like old Egyptian revival. So it's almost to like transpose this sort of like authority of just like the aesthetic of always being there to probably resonate permanence. Because also during this time, through like the advancement of like medical education and the medical community, a lot of bodies were being stolen from graveyards. But yeah, no, I just thought antiquity as a design feature was really interesting.
And I guess it continued to be a design feature
Yeah.
of these institutions moving forward. So that was the domestic precedent, but the real inspiration for what we now know as the rural cemeteries came from Europe, and specifically Père Lachaise in Paris. In 1804, it was one of the four established in the first decade of the 19th century. It was the former estate of François d'Aix de Lachaise, who was a Jesuit priest, and most specifically and most importantly for us, he was a gardener. And it was established for largely the same reasons we'll see in US cemeteries that sought to emulate them: the influence of the Romantic, overcrowding, spread of disease concerns, and the desire to create a natural landscape within an urban environment. And most importantly, I think for those who sought inspiration here, at least in terms of the US designers, it quickly became a tourist destination and a place of, as it was described then, a culture and emotion, for the idea that you were surrounding the inhabitants with monuments and trees, and this would create sort of an emotive space. So now we have the two precedents, and we move into what's considered the rural cemetery movement. And I think just for the onset, it's kind of a misnomer. These are really garden cemeteries, and suburban by location, but rural by design. And again, we see the similar reasons for these cemeteries coming into play as we did with Père Lachaise. It's various burial crises. So every major city is having a burial crisis in which there are current concerns of overcrowding in churchyard graveyards, disease spreading, and miasmas that were supposedly present with the stench of death in some of these areas. Populations were increasing. The desire to protect, as Sarah said, the dead from theft and displacement, and a desire to provide places for culture, similar to Père Lachaise. So those were all going on, but what I think is most interesting about that, it was the shift in the Romantic influence on the perception of death that also led these institutions to come to existence. Death no longer became something to be feared, but to be celebrated, accepted, if not embraced, directly informed by the Unitarian movement. So death no longer became fearsome, but it became a natural life path, and it was reflected in the architecture and art in these institutions. Also, what I think is most interesting about these is that they really were this concept of a didactic landscape. And what I mean by that is that when we look back on these institutions, what we talk about is the overcrowding, the spread of disease that really led to their invention. At the time, the arguments for their founding were much more on evoking sentiment than aesthetics. It was believed that rural cemeteries in their natural setting would teach the public a sense of sentimentality. It would temper the aggressive and serve as a place to learn about morality and patriotism through art and the experience of being around nature. Another goal for the cemetery founders was to memorialize history. As the nation was sort of expanding, there was an increasing desire to create a cultural history, one specifically that was stable and could be dug up and moved around. They wanted to create the sense of legacy for the US. And so we see a lot of patriotism involved in these early cemeteries. All of them evoke the picturesque, a natural-esque environment, controlled to sort of induce a certain sentiment. And it was this sense of a return to imagined nature, this concept that like beyond the hustle of cities, these natural environments existed. And the paradigm for these institutions, at least in the US, was Mount Auburn Cemetery, founded in 1831 by the Massachusetts Horticulture Society. Designed by lawyer Henry Dearborn and surveyor Alexander Wadsworth. Themes we see again in other cemeteries. It was situated on a high point, beautiful views, great terrain and water bodies, 72 acres then, now 175. What made Mount Auburn so special and continues to make it so special today is that it marks a true contrast with the city life around it. Jamaica Plains is outside. its gates, when you go there, you're completely engulfed in nature. It's been described as an attractive place of history, and I think that's apt, but it really shows the distinction between what these cemeteries offered, which was something unlike the city: curvilinear roads, terrain that was naturally formed around the trees and monuments that were placed there. And while Cambridge is all well and good, we're here to talk about New York. And so let's paint the picture of prior to the founding of Greenwood Cemetery. 1838, New York City is in the middle of industrial revolution, huge growth rate, cholera epidemics, drastic economic up and downs, new age of scientific thought and authority, urban development increasing. And so in addition to those factors, as I mentioned earlier, we have these burial crises. And in 1822, this concern about overcrowding sort of reached a head, especially at Trinity Church, where there was 120,000 bodies buried back there. And as you can imagine, lower Manhattan was sort of consumed by the horrible stench of decay. And this led to fears about the spread of disease, and also led New York legislators to pass an 1823 law that prevented burials to continue in lower Manhattan. But this didn't really stop the process. There needed to be a longer term solution, so city planners began sort of considering what their options were. Now let's look specifically at Brooklyn. So incorporated in 1834, and we're going to turn our attention to Henry Evelyn Pierpont, who is Greenwood's founder. He played a significant role in the planning of Brooklyn, and he laid out the streets and so on. So he traveled to Europe. He sees famous cemeteries like Père Lachaise, and he comes back with a vision for a cultural institution on a similar scale and scope in Brooklyn. And due to his sort of prominent position as one of the people that laid out the city, he reserves land in the Gowanus Heights for the purpose of developing a cemetery. Additionally, an advantage for him was that it was close to the Brooklyn Ferry, which he was a principal investor in.
I think also this sort of shows like the investment that the city of Brooklyn was trying to make, right? Like now they were incorporated and they are looking to compete with Manhattan. And Greenwood is,
we have something they don't have in this situation.
It's an attraction. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. Went the wrong direction, pardon me. So also the site was chosen, as Mount Auburn was, for views, and specifically here we have views of the harbor, Manhattan, and the ocean. And our landscape and its rolling hills and terrain is directly informed by the Harbor Hill Moraine, which is the sort of complete movement of the Laurentide ice sheet of the Wisconsin Stage Glacier, which reached its southerly advance almost 18,000 years ago and formed Long Island and Brooklyn. And so we are on both the moraine side and the outwash that leads into Flatbush. Oh, yes, there's Greenwood. Sorry.
Yeah, the animation.
I forgot the animation, pardon me. So this is not Greenwood in its illustration, but it's an idea of perhaps what the landscape looked like at the time. The land was purchased from Dutch settlers relatively cheap because of the financial crisis and panic in 1837. So this concept that it was a natural landscape is not really accurate. It had been used for farmland. There were various patches of old growth forest that was comprised of an oak hickory stand, but largely this land had been cultivated. Quickly during the cemetery's early years, it really became what the cemetery's founders hoped it would be, which was a cultural institution, a site of passive recreation, and a space for the dead as much as a space for the living. But that was slightly out of order, but nevertheless, we'll continue on. So we're at the founding of the cemetery. Henry Evelyn Pierpont has laid out the landscape about where it's going to be, but he needs someone who knows how to construct landscapes. And so he commissions David Bates Douglas, who was a Renaissance man, so to speak. He was a civil engineer, an officer in the War of 1812, a professor, a plant hunter, an engineer on the surveying expedition of the Michigan Territory. And he got to know Brooklyn and gained sort of public notoriety from surveying the railroad route from Brooklyn to Jamaica, Queens, and for developing the preliminary plans and route for the Croton Aqueduct, which supplies the city with its drinking water. His goal was, in his words, to sculpt the existing terrain of Greenwood into nature in her finest dress, sort of to enhance the existing topography, use it to provide shade and openings to create this sense of sentiment, winding roads, dramatic clearings, and framed views of the city, ocean, and Brooklyn. So again, this idea that there would be areas that were enclosed in trees and shrubs, opening monuments there. His vision was to really create this emotional landscape that Henry Everland Pierpont sort of had directed him to do so. Greenwood's first burial occurred in 1840, and during its early years, it was quite lean. Not a lot of money. The landscape had to speak for itself. And David Bates Douglas created a 4-mile highlight tour, essentially, a carriage ride throughout the grounds, created to drive curiosity and also drum up sales. But that was the last, impact that David Bates Douglas had. He left for Kenyon College in 1841. And unfortunately, there's very little information about those who came next, who largely shaped the landscape in more direct ways. Almarin Hotchkiss was particularly important in that, and he went on to design Bellefontaine Cemetery. George Burrell, these names, George Gamby, we just don't have evidence of what they did, but we just know that they served here after he left. So what was the landscape after he left? Well, we're going to read these quotes and we're going to talk about a little bit about what they mean. So this is from Greenwood Cemetery, History of the Institution from 1838 to 1864 by Nehemiah Cleveland, who was the first historian of Greenwood. And so he's talking about the landscape, and he says, without going further into particulars in this respect, it is sufficient to say that the whole question of trees, you know what, I'll give you a moment to read this. I think it's easier. But I'll read the bolded part. So clearly this is wrong, unless it can be shown that a stagnant atmosphere, that shade and dampness and moodiness and decay, with whole armies of bugs and caterpillars, are promotive of cheerfulness and conducive to health. So this language really marks a movement away from the picturesque immediately after the cemetery's founding. This concept that David Bates Douglas' original vision was sort of compromised quite quickly is there. This argument against shade, and this argument due to the moodiness or health effects that it could create, was one approach. The next approach was
also making an enemy of bugs and caterpillars.
Right.
Alrighty. Whole armies.
The cemetery grounds, which look best at all seasons and give the highest satisfaction to the eye, are those which most nearly resemble a well-kept lawn. As a general thing, shrubbery and trees in these little plots are fatal to neatness. So we have health concerns, we have neatness.
A value of order.
And a state of quiet and repose is an important ingredient in the passive sublime, and moving the soil for the purpose of culture, even on a grave, is destructive of repose. So the fact that the picturesque, with its densely planted areas opening up into clearings, is destructive of health, it's not neat, and it's also destructive of repose, the hallmark of a cemetery.
Yeah, and the last one's a bit of a dig toward the lot holders, right? Who may have been using their lots as a gardening space.
It's also in many respects the justification for the rules and regulations that were really to inform the next era of cemetery development. When the cemetery first began, lot owners could plant on their lots. we'll get to that in a moment. But so we look at, this is the main entrance circa 1862, and to our eye, it doesn't look particularly picturesque. There are evergreens and there are silver maples planted along the road and fence, and it's quite sparse. It's linear as well, and it doesn't reflect the density and natural quality that David Bates Douglas was looking to intending. This is another picture. So the picturesque is present here, but as the landscape evolves and more graves come into play, the move away from the picturesque begins. As you look into the distance there, as new graves are being developed, the land is being cleared. And although there are trees in the foreground, there are fewer trees in the background where more graves are going.
Yeah, and actually this is the same image, but the former image was the furthest extent of the southern border of the cemetery at the time, because at its founding, it was only 178 acres, and then it expanded rather quickly to 474. So this is essentially from the same position.
From a different angle.
Yeah.
So mid to late 19th century, the cemetery in its Board of Trustee minutes, there begin to be warnings of overplanting and rules against lot owner plantings, hedges, and enclosures. And as you can see by the amount of gravestones here, this idea that the cemetery was still functioning as an alternative to the city, it became more urban as it became developed. The picturesque really couldn't be sustained in a landscape like this where there was the density of gravestones. And so at the time, as we said earlier, the lot owners were managing their own lots, and there was a general lack of uniformity. As more people began to be buried there, the aesthetic changed because of personal approach. I mean, as you can see on the image on the right, those dense planting enclosures were supposed to be maintained by the lot owners. And obviously, in this case, that mausoleum got completely overrun. And so the cemetery was also dealing with these issues of a lot of maintenance that needed to be performed to preserve these, and the lot owners themselves no longer doing it. And so this language that we see in the history and in the minutes of the trustees, they really view these obstructions in the landscape as an eyesore, and it becomes a bone of contention with relations to lot owners later on as well.
Yeah, these hedges and the enclosures also like give the effect that there are individual families, right? This isn't one sort of like expansive community of the dead. It looks, compartmentalized.
And also at the time, a lot of these were surrounded by borders to make them further compartmentalized, which made even any attempt at mowing, which was done by hand at the time, more challenging. So, big picture, 1847, 9 years after Greenwood's founding, New York State Legislature passes the Rural Cemetery Law, which authorized nonprofit, including religious institutions, to establish cemeteries on rural land and sell burial plots. And it exempted from property taxation land that was so used. So it capped the size at 250 per county, and this is particularly important when we think about Queens. So there are 17 that are in each county. So we have Greenwood and Woodlawn, the earliest of the two. And there's 2,244 acres in Queens alone. And Queens is the largest county and borough, but also a lot of these cemeteries straddle the line between Brooklyn and Queens in order to capitalize on more space beyond the 250 that they were allotted. And also occasionally they would exist as two separate institutions separated by a road. So 1867 rolls around. Well, this is a picture of 1867. 1863, the Gothic Revival Gatehouse that you see in the foreground there was completed. the rural quality of the landscape was disappearing. And again, as we discussed, it was becoming more urban as the cemetery was growing. It was becoming more defined, and the plantings were becoming more linear. And its contrast to the city was sort of blurring. Now, the movement away from the picturesque found an ally in Ohio, and that's where we're going next. So picturesque, and this is a image from The Landscape, a didactic poem in 3 books by Uvedale Price from 1794. And this shows an example of the picturesque. This is nature's power over man, so to speak. And this is the beautiful. And this is what same landscape again, cleared of vegetation, much easier to maintain.
And even here you see like the aesthetic of the building has changed from less ornate in its transition. Boom.
Yeah, everything's simplified. And what we see is really informing all of the evolutions of the cemetery from the rural cemetery movement on is this theme of making these landscapes easier to maintain. And one of the great champions of that was Adolf Strausch, who in my opinion is sort of an unfortunate footnote in landscape architecture, but he did so much for the industry that I think he should really be more appreciated. So he is German trained, English trained horticulturist, misses a train, ends up in Cincinnati, gets asked by the wealthy landowners of Cincinnati to basically redesign their suburb. And then he's asked to go to Spring Grove, the cemetery that they run in 1845, and he gets there and basically says they're doing everything wrong. He says it's a mess. The landscape looks like a sculpture yard. And so he's brought in there to first address a swamp. And I think what's most important about Adolf Strausch is, unlike Mount Auburn and Greenwood, Spring Grove was not located in a beautiful area. Through his influence, he made the landscape his conception of beautiful. He wanted to sort of enforce his vision on the natural landscape. But it's important to note that he built the beauty of Spring Grove, and did so by basically assuming power and banning outside gardeners, creating this perpetual care system, which will rear its head later. But it's this concept that cemetery professionals needed to maintain the lots and should be paid to do so as an additional fee from a lot owner. He professionalized cemetery worker as a position. He created this idea of superintendent of grounds, which would then inform countless positions following it, as before there was no title. He eliminated whimsical monuments. He reduced monument height, encouraged a single family monument, and required foundations. In 1855, as he continued to climb up the ladder, he was given more and more freedom by Spring Grove because of what he was accomplishing there. He becomes superintendent, and he directly reports to the board on landscape issues. This is a huge turning point and sort of triggers the development of landscape architecture. He was a professional, unlike David Bates Douglas, who, although trained as a civil engineer, had a landscape background, but he was a professional, whereas amateurs or non-professionals were asked before to design these landscapes. He was specifically tasked with managing the cemetery's appearance, not the burial components of the cemetery. His goal was to create a uniform landscape with intentionally placed trees and shrubs and groves, framing long vistas, and to create less fragmentary scenes. And so the wild woodsy appearance was reduced, and he's creating this concept of these expansive lawns. And there's a great deal of influence on lawn. And what you'll notice in this picture here, there are no gravestones really. There's a monument there in the water body, but there are no gravestones. There's a lot of lawn too. And another, aspect is that he really brought into the efficiency of the cemetery. We consider it an element of the design of the cemetery, but he was really trying to make the cemetery also easier to maintain. But this is a paradox again, because while the cemetery there might have been less obstructions to maintenance, it really required an army of workers to maintain to the degree he wanted, and drastically increased the reliance on mowing. And so we returned to Brooklyn, and this concern that the cemetery was being overwhelmed by the whims of lot owners met a very sympathetic approach with Strauch's, which was beginning to rise in prominence throughout the US. So there's more rules and regulations on lot owners. There's an emphasis on naturally arranged trees and shrubbery and close clipped lawns to evoke a quiet simplicity and neatness and beauty. This quote is great from 1862. However pleasant the shade, the sunshine is better. Our experience shows that it would require but a few years of unchecked growth to convert the whole cemetery into a jungle. And to prevent the cemetery from being a jungle, we need a lot of people cutting grass. So this is another moment from the Board of Trustees minutes. The labor required to maintain the grounds, there were 45 laborers to dig and sod graves, 50 to mow the entire ground, including all occupied lots, 20 to rake, 40 to grade, 25 to make and pave the roads and paths, and 4 for stone breaking. In addition, 32 cart drivers were employed to grade, cart, grass, prepare graves, and work on the roads and paths. We needed that army that Strauch has sort of hinted at. This was kind of been easier to maintain, but it was a lot more dominant. And it certainly wasn't easy to maintain because this landscape wasn't really made to grow grass. In order to make it conducive to grass, a lot of things had to be done. For example, in 1875, the cemetery dug up, manured, and reseeded lots that were covered with moss or weeds and adopted a more general and thorough system of tree removals to obviate the evils attending excessive shade. So at the cemetery's founding, trees are great. We love shade, we love clearings and vistas. Then there's a turning point in 1875 where trees start becoming evil. And so more attention becomes on the grass. And as they say in 1884, special attention has been given this year to the grass. Some sections have been mown as many as 12 times during the summer, and the average number of cuttings over the whole ground has been about 8. This would be equivalent to mowing once an area of over 2,800 acres. About 160 acres have been carefully weeded, and 31 acres well covered in the fall with the best stable manure. The beautiful appearance of the lawn, which has been the subject of much gratifying comment by visitors, has been the result in part of this frequent cutting. And this is like, it couldn't be more different from this conception at the cemetery's founding, which was sort of like not a real forest, but focusing on the forest assets as defining elements. And so, again, in 1886, this concern about obstructions to mowing rears its head again. The greater part of the cemetery is covered with graves, monuments, head and footstones, fences and hedges, and a large number of graves are covered with vines and flowers, so that the mowing has to be done with great care and a large part of it with a sickle. 5 acres of all unobstructed lawn can be mowed in less time than 1 acre of the ground in the cemetery. So they're really angling to remove any and all obstruction that would prevent them from mowing efficiently. And then in 1879, mechanical lawnmowers introduced into the fleet. 100 men are still required to mow. And by 1911, we were mowing the grass 7 times, the entire 404 acres of turf. So more rules and restrictions, mid to late 19th century, rules against lot owner plantings, hedges and enclosures. And then in 1851, Greenwood, like Spring Grove, institutes its own perpetual care fund. So initially, the cemetery's founding, as we mentioned, Lot owners were expected to care for their lots and had more control over their lots, which directly impacted the appearance of the landscape, creating a sort of hodgepodge effect and areas of neglect. What occurred next was that the cemetery took that over and required those who wished to have care performed on their cemetery, in addition to the regular mowing that was performed, pay an additional sum. And so this changes a lot of the look of the landscape and makes the cemetery's management have sort of the right to begin to remove a lot of the vegetation that's obstructing their maintenance. And by 1895, the cemetery reached its current size of 478 acres. And by 1914, relevant to Sarah and I, a new department for the care of the trees in the cemetery was organized during the year, and many trees were pruned, sprayed with arsenate of lead, and repaired with cement or pitch where necessary. And fortunately, we're no longer doing that. At the same time as this was going on in the East Coast, across the country, a new style of cemetery was being developed, one that would succeed Strauch's landscape lawn conception. And this is the Memorial Park, specifically Forest Lawn Cemetery, which is itself a bit of a misnomer because it's primarily lawn, and there's very little forest here.
It wouldn't be a misnomer if they're referring to the grass being the forest.
Very true.
Yeah.
So founded in 1906, Glendale, California. Didn't really become what it is today until it was taken over by the salesman Hubert Eaton in 1916. And he really developed this concept of the Memorial Park. He transformed 12 acres into a 300-acre sprawling site in many institutions. But before we get to that, it's important to know, as my colleague has pointed out, that this comes after the collapse of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, and Glendale itself in California was specifically known as a sundown town. It had a terrible racist legacy, and within Forest Lawn, they forbade the burying of African Americans, and in fact, buried a member of the American Nazi Party and the Grand Cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan. So what these institutions also reflected was the white flight from the cities to the suburbs, and to create a landscape that felt more like home for them. And so we really do begin to see this emphasis on lawn as a sympathetic quality there. So 4 main takeaways from what Forest Lawn did. Again, reinforcing that professional management that Strauch had implied, but unlike Strauch, nature became a passive backdrop here. The memorials were not supposed to be about the individual, they were supposed to be about community. They were supposed to be about Christianity, of patriotism. They directly rejected the gloom of the Victorian period. He created specific halls of liberty, American History Museum, exact replicas of historic buildings. It's a little bit like Disney World. In order to maintain a lawn like this, the entire landscape is irrigated. There were restrictions abound, only bronze markers. There were theme sections, but lot owners could do very little in this landscape. He also had this sort of unique obsession with replicas of very significant pieces of art, such as this life-size David and an amphitheater, which was built to house the crucifixion, a picture of titanic proportions, which was 195 feet by 45 feet and weighed 3,500 pounds. One of my favorite anecdote about Hubert Eaton, aside from his like scouring the earth for replicas of major works of art and creating a museum of American patriotism, was that, and it sort of epitomizes his whole vision of what the Memorial Park would be, was that he was desperate to find a statue of smiling Jesus. He really didn't want any sad Jesus or moody Jesus. He was really focused on finding a white, smiling Jesus. So that's California for you. And
important tangent.
Yeah, nice. Sorry about that.
It's good.
Yeah. Okay, so we don't see memorial park landscape developments until the late 60s, 70s, into the 80s at the beginning. But at the beginning and middle of the 20th century, in a sort of incremental increase in the amount of rules governing lot owners. Removal of enclosures are done under the auspices of the war effort. Removal of trees are done by taste, and iron furniture is all removed from the cemetery. But one of the biggest developments of this time is this 1949 change due to a scandal with cemeteries basically practicing graft within the cities. The oversight of public cemeteries and enforcement of the laws and regulations that apply to them began to be delegated to the New York State Cemetery Board. This was a huge deal because cemeteries now fall under state's direct supervision. The Cemetery Board was created by statute in 1949, following this scathing report by the Attorney General, who's basically like, these cemeteries are basically just lining their pockets and not operating in an appropriate way. So the board that manages cemeteries now is the Secretary of State, the Department of Law, and the Department of Health. This governs 1,800 cemeteries. And it also required that all cemeteries in New York were going to be nonprofit entities. Back to David. Now, we're going to skip over the next 50 odd years where much development took place in Greenwood, including the construction of a large architectural mausoleum, a columbarium, our listing on the Register of Historic Places in 1997, buildings throughout becoming city landmarks, and the site itself becoming a National Historic Landmark in 2006. Just as notably was our president, Richard J. Moylan's recognition that in order to survive when space was eliminated was the establishment of the Greenwood Historic Fund, which was established in 1999 as a 501c3. Cemeteries are 501c13s. And the Greenwood Historic Fund's mission is to maintain the Greenwood Cemetery's monuments and buildings of historical, cultural, and architectural significance, advance public knowledge and appreciation of this significance, and preserve the natural habitat and grasslands of one of New York's first green spaces. This was to cement and sort of celebrate Greenwood's role as a cultural institution. We see that in the events that we continue to host to this day. So we have this Battle of Brooklyn reenactment. We have an annual Memorial Day concert. We host nighttime events like Niblo's Garden, Rooftop Films, Moth Radio Hour. We have an artist in residence. And this really sort of marked a moment where we began to reflect on the landscape challenges that we face, no longer the cultural ones. So Sarah, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Oh boy. It's already 7:45.
Sorry about that. A lot of history to cover.
I'm gonna try and breeze through this. Because I want to hear your questions. So this is not working. All right, I'm sorry. My computer seems to have frozen. There we go.
There you go.
All right, so as Joe alluded to, Greenwood today is sort of a mosaic of all these different, former genres. Obviously with the goal to like financially sustain itself in perpetuity. So the progression of this evolution is to a landscape that is dominated by turf. It was historically like backed by culture and financial justifications, often citing that reducing the clutter of ornamentation and non-turf vegetation will make the landscape easier to manage, as Joe noted before. But honestly, what we have found through the years and also like annotated in the annual reports of Greenwood is that even though it appears it would require less detail work, it is very resource intensive, always has been. And especially as our local climate shifts to being hotter with longer periods of extreme drought and frequent storm events, it's just sort of creating a environment that is conducive to a lot of aesthetic challenges, as can be seen here, just like the patchwork of the grasses there, the warm and cool season grasses. This aerial photo was taken in April of 2018. But in the most recent decade, the trees of Greenwood have felt the impact of storm events most violently. So 10 years ago during Superstorm Sandy, which if no one was in New York City at the time or didn't feel its impact, it was a storm that lasted about 12 hours. Greenwood lost over 300 trees, and it was pretty devastating, most of them mature. And then 2 years ago, sorry, I did this for dramatic effect, Hurricane Isaias swept through New York City in about 20 and 30 minutes. Greenwood lost 45 trees and hundreds were damaged. I just want to note that the tree on the right is, that tree is probably older than Greenwood when it started growing. And I tried to capture just how humans are dwarfed by it, but a 20-minute storm just totally ripped it apart. All right, so let's talk about the living collection, and honestly where Joe and I started on sort of like reimagining how we manage this landscape. So beyond a list of notable trees that were produced by Brooklyn Botanic Garden in 1987, there's very little historic record about old plant purchases or a complete inventory of Greenwood's trees prior to 2006. That is when the first comprehensive inventory was completed, and it was later updated in 2016 when I joined the team. The tree collection was accredited in 2015, and then it was later, it advanced in level up to a level 3 in 2018. This inventory was really a start of the development of a plant records repository. I'm sure you know, us being a cemetery, our record keeping on interments and graves and monuments is so vast and impressive, but there was almost zero record keeping on any of the plants in the grounds. Most arboretums and botanic gardens use BG base. That was really one of the only record keeping options that we had. I feel like this is just like inside baseball. But BG base didn't have a mapping component, which is something that we really needed, just with Greenwood being almost 500 acres. So we developed a plant record system using Esri's ArcGIS systems with an emphasis on spatial data, obviously. We surveyed their existing tools and built our own. One of them is this workforce tracking app. It allows us to track maintenance and tree accessions in the landscape over time. It also allows us to prioritize work and maintain, this is one of the multiple lines of communication with our workforce. So the people that are doing the work on the trees. Also, the opportunity of acquiring an inventory of trees, we were able to take stock of what was here. And this allowed us to approach the trees as a collection, strategize the preservation for the future. One of the first steps was to diversify the collection. As you can see, a challenge in the era of climate change back in 2006, the collection was not very diverse. Since 2006, with like such intense planting projects over the years, we have effectively doubled our genre and quadrupled our species and hybrids. And just so you can really understand like how vulnerable the tree collection was back in 2006, this was, pre-Sandy. 21% of the collection was maples, but actually 95% of that was just all Norway maples. So theoretically, if there was a pathogen, or an insect that was introduced that only attacked Norway maples, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but it would mean that 21% of Greenwood's tree collection would just be gone. So opportunity at Greenwood, now being an arboretum. We don't just purchase trees from commercial nurseries anymore, but we source them from arboreta and botanic gardens. This allows us to acquire material from more local plant sources, thus diversifying the genetic lineage of our collection. Just to note, most of the plants that you buy in commercial nurseries, you can probably, draw a line back to like the same parent plant from 80 years ago. We also introduced trial hybrids in partnership with different institutions. So, for example, we have a collection of oaks that were cultivated at Cornell University, and these were hybridized to tolerate urban conditions. And then we have a collection of American chestnuts. These chestnuts are essentially trials to see if they are blight resistant. I'm sure you guys know the history of the American chestnut tree and its demise, but this is also in partnership with the American Chestnut Foundation. Challenge of the legacy of the lawn landscape. So the size class distribution here relates to the size of a tree at maturity. So as you can see, historically, it seems, very large trees were prioritized in the planting. And now we are, prioritizing understory trees like dogwood and pawpaw and hollies. And although, again, historically, these might have been seen as cluttering the landscape and disrupting view sheds, we love their beauty, their shade, and also the resources that provide the wildlife. Greenwood has a massive birder community. So this, the tree inventory has also allowed us to strategically prioritize work. So deferred maintenance on a lot of the trees, and also to strategically grow the collection so that it can exist for future generations. What sort of this distribution is showing is that there seemed to have been just an oversight of the trees. The trees always seem to just be like the backdrop of Greenwood, not in the forefront. As Joe said, like, the lawns are the monuments. And so in 2000, sort of indicative of that is in 2006, over 80% of the collection was of established or mature age. So this makes the collection, again, vulnerable to disturbances without any routine planting projects. And our goal was to reverse this trend because, more young trees now mean more established and mature trees in the future. This is indicative. So this was like post Sandy, where we saw a lot of tree loss. And in response, the New York Restoration Project planted 700 trees in Greenwood. But even this massive planting was not enough to establish a robust population of young trees in the total collection, that is. So over the past decade, Greenwood has lost over 500 trees to storm events and increasingly vulnerable to invasive insects and pathogens. These are just, the challenges of our day. So 17% of the collection is susceptible to bacterial leaf scorch. This affects dogwoods, maples, sycamores, London plane, oaks. In fact, 18 of our mature oaks have tested positive for bacterial leaf scorch. We are trialing treatments for them. Oak wilt, which is it's a fungus that attacks the cambium layer of trees and usually quickly kills them, especially if these trees lack the ability to produce tyloses. I feel like we could give like 8 presentations on some of the challenges of Greenwood. So this oak wilt predominantly attacks the red oak group. Red oak group oaks are at a higher risk of mortality. And back in 2006, that was 95% of our oak trees. So, since 2016, we have been prioritizing the white oak group. and hybrids, they do have the ability to produce these tiny little structures called tyloses. It's essentially a defense mechanism that the tree has where it will compartmentalize where it notices there's an infection or an invasion happening, and essentially like amputate its own limb. And I mean, we do 0.2% of our collection is at risk of emerald ash borer. I'm sure you know why. We don't have many ash trees left. 14.5% are at risk of Asian longhorn beetle. And then Phytophthora puts at risk all of our European beech trees, of which we only have about 169 left. And we're not really planting anymore. European beech trees, they are not long for the climate of Greenwood anymore. It's too humid, too hot. All right, so these are our results, our hard work of implementing a management plan. And we are not done planting. We are planting 400 trees this year, probably more, because we get a little purchase happy. And this is thanks to funding from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation's Urban Forestry Grant. All right, so all these threats, all these challenges to our living collection opens up an opportunity to collaborate. So what you're looking at here is a collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service. It's a wood boring beetle scouting project. And this has been about a 4-year project so far. And about 3 years ago, what emerged from the branch of a European beech tree that was stuffed into that barrel was a new insect to science, had never been identified before. This is an Agrylus species, so it is related to the emerald ash borer. And as of now, there's no indication that this species is an actual threat to the urban forest. But also what has come of this research is there are new insect host plant associations that have been identified. So we're understanding sort of like how insects are readapting to their changing world. A large part of this work is due to the people that steward the collection. So we mentioned this a little bit, but there wasn't really an established horticulture department at Greenwood until Joe was hired. There are now 7 dedicated staff members that are a part of our crew, and we provide continuous training, certification, and education in arboriculture, just because, you know, things are constantly changing, and we want to be in the know. We want best practices all the time. Oh, and this was also transformative for Greenwood because these workers are part of a union staff where the main job classification previously was just grave digger. Boom. Opportunity for tree preservation. Joe, I don't know if you want to interject here.
Sure. So, you know, in a lot of public gardens and arboreta, there's this debate between removal and maintenance of older trees. And I think where we've really been focusing on is we have the luxury to be able to sort of document the impact of the work that we do to preserve these trees. So we focus on preservation first because we think that, you know, the largest living organisms in the landscape require specific forms of maintenance.
Sorry, risk and safety are first, preservation second.
Right, when we're talking about the mature trees, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm going to let you finish. Sorry.
So in some of these examples, we've used techniques such as fracture pruning, which means that at the point of cut, we rip the branch to stimulate what would happen if the branch were ripped off during a storm event. The theory is to create a better source to inoculate for beneficial organisms that might not enter the wood in a straight cut. We also practice crown reduction and retrenchment, which means that we're pruning to enhance the tree's natural processes of crown shrinking as it ages.
All right. And sort of along with tree preservation also comes with achieving accolades for our collection to sort of just like promote their importance, even in like the context of New York State. So this sassafras tree was crowned its title of State Champion Big Tree back in 2016, and it still stands today. Tree preservation in our eyes also extends to public engagement and education. So this was a volunteer street tree planting project that happened in partnership with Trees New York along the sidewalk of 37th Street, which is the street that sort of divides Greenwood Cemetery from a huge bus terminal. Other events in this program also included the involvement of kids. And here you can see where stewardship isn't just about planting, but it's also about tree maintenance. That's probably more important than its planting. So these children were removing litter, decompacting the soil, and removing weeds. Yeah, because there were some vines growing on some of the trees. Molly Ruzzi and actually Matthew Wills is highlighted in this screenshot. Matthew's in the audience. Shout out Matthew. But community engagement also means, citizen science and engaging the people that are already in the field who are documenting the wildlife and the floral life that they are seeing. And this helps, not only us, but also, this is a citizen science app that is iNaturalist, which is essentially a publicly shared database of observations, but it also really helps us, just this past spring when the spotted lanternfly was invading New York City, the first observations were made by iNaturalists. So it informs us and the maintenance that we do and assessing the problem. But it also, gives ownership a lot to like the visitors here. They are growing their knowledge of Greenwood and also of New York City. And so it really is, that knowledge is, one asset of ownership, I think. So Greenwood has always been preserving and telling stories about the people who are interred here. But with the accreditation of our living collection, we were now able to tell the story about our trees. In 2015, we launched an interpretive master plan that went beyond identifying each tree by its species. So within this plan was a total redesign of our free visitor map. Historically, our visitor map, you saw one of them, it just highlighted a tour route. And, previous years, it would highlight permanent residents. So really, famous people that are buried at Greenwood. But now we've included 25 notable celebrated trees within our arboretum. And this also, we also developed a free mobile app that expands the information on the trees, also on the notable residents, and elaborates information on our wildlife and other ecosystem functions of the cemetery. And so this work culminated and allowed us to enter the New York State Zoo's Botanical Gardens and Arboreta program. This grant is very cool. It provides consistent operational support for existing natural heritage collections and interpretive programs, with the main goal to expand the quality and the number of natural heritage learning opportunities for the public. So not just this funding, but just this interpretive work and our accreditation as an arboretum has really helped elevate, the different function and meaning of a cemetery. So a place for the dead, but also for the perpetual living. And I wish I had that slide that was like the wide view of all the cemeteries in New York City, because
said
in terms
a quarter of the population is trapped. Machinery on
oh, thanks, Joan. Is, you know, the number of acres that like these places could, if the landscape were managed differently to support, you know, more wildlife, more diversity, it would just, you know, increase, I think, the resilience of the city. It's over 4,000 acres. All right, so as you might have assumed, turf is not involved in our natural heritage collection. And it is an enduring challenge, not only operationally, but also, you know, financially. So here where you're looking at is the soon to be Chapel Meadow. On the right is our historic chapel built in 1911 by Warren and Wetmore. And behind it is our receiving tomb, but don't mind that. Just look at the green sward. Those are on slopes that are, what are they? They're like a 1-to-1 ratio, Joe. They're on a 1-to-1. They're very steep. And no one walks on them. It's too steep for that. They're unsafe. What is the utility? And so in 2017, we brought in Larry Weiner, Landscape Associates, to essentially transform this from turf and reimagine it into a perennial meadow made of mostly native straight species. And it also adds just more variation seasonally, which again, we were kind of like rebels in, you know, the lawn cult, because one of the reasons that the lawn was seen as so desirable is that it had a uniform appearance all year, of which these don't. In 2020, we extended the Chapel Meadow to the sides of the roads on these banks. Most of Greenwood's roads kind of look like they were excavated through the ground. So they always are, you know, below the sides of the land. And so now we are stabilizing the soil there, and we've expanded the wildlife buffet. All right, so unfortunately, that Chapel Meadow planting can't work everywhere. Sorry. So right now, I want to talk about something that is kind of concealed and a bit of a mystery if you don't understand the layout. So right now, this graphic is showing the evolution of lot layout, and it definitely corresponds with the previous cemetery periods that Joe was speaking to earlier. So in our more historic areas of the cemetery is something that we have named the 19th century arrangement of lots. As you can see, they are interplanted with trees and shrubbery. They are non-uniform, they are non-symmetrical, and they're different shapes, and they're more expansive in their layout. Then comes the 50s, 80s arrangement. It has a lot of characteristics like the Memorial Park, including the standardizing of the headstones. So they're shorter, uniform, and then that is kind of carried over into the current infill arrangement. This is, visually almost identical to the headstones of the 50s, 80s arrangement, only it is not developed in a large expanse like the 50s, 80s arrangement. It's sort of interworked between, like, wherever there is space between lots that were established in the 19th century. So here I just want you to take note. This is an actual snapshot of the outlay of some of the lots in Greenwood. There's about 10 acres that are shown here, almost 1,400 lots, and over 30% are the infill lots. There's also more trees in these areas. There's more space to plant them, and there's more space to retain them. And there's also more ornamentation wherever there's the 19th century layout. So this is a really good example. This is the monument of Charlotte Kanda. I feel like she's only really been made famous by this monument. She just died young. That, I think that's her story. And then this is an example of the infill lots that I was talking about. So they are all, can you see no, you can't. All right. So they are all uniform in design and, symmetrically laid. Oh, they can? Okay,
Yeah.
Great. And then over here, it's juxtaposed with older monumentation. All right. This is another example where the modern butts up against the historic. So this is gray. This is a 19th century layout. This area is one of the public lots. So at the original founding of the cemetery, the public lots were established and often purchased by, church organizations, orphanage organizations, and also just like allocated for the general public of like really modest means and purchasing power. And so they, they're laid out, they're very small and they're laid out in a gridded fashion with almost no space in between the lot boundaries. But one thing that is very different about them is that they still retain that like really historic 19th century character in their headstones, non-uniform. I mean, they are smaller, but that again is because, most of the people who are purchasing lots did not have a lot of money. But again, they're very different than what the sort of lawn landscape influence later had on Greenwood. So in the foreground is more of the modern memorial park layout. Headstones are flush, super easy to mow and cultivate fine turf. And then behind it, it does have a little shaggy meadow-like appearance, if you will. And that is very intentional, which I will speak to in a second. All right, so meet our in-house workforce. They resurface, they perpetually care for lots, and they conduct all the burials. And we have now outsourced our lawn maintenance to to Brightview, who does majority of the mowing of the lawn. And let's talk about the beast of burden. So Greenwood is 478 acres, 84% of which is just turf. We do have almost 10 acres scattered around of more dense thicket of wooded areas. These areas are not mown, obviously, and there's very little maintenance done on them annually. Another challenge to not only mowing the lawn, but also maintaining a uniform appearance, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a lot of challenges that come with the topography of Greenwood. At its onset, this was one of the most attractive qualities to Pierpont and the men who established this area to be a cemetery, but it's very challenging. It varies from like almost 200 feet in elevation. We have 4 water bodies, 2 of which are natural kettle ponds, so they were formed by the glacier, and just deep valleys, steep hills. It's really beautiful. You get really disoriented in it. And also we put out remote sensors in the field and actually found that we have like 5 distinct microclimates in the cemetery. I wish I had a map of that for you guys. So one of the obvious challenges that hasn't really been explicitly talked about, because so much of the progression and the evolution of landscape design historically has been to reduce the ornamentation and standardize monumentation, which is like it's really interesting because it totally contrasts one of the main features that was so attractive to Greenwood. Joe didn't mention this in the beginning, but Greenwood at its establishment before the public parks, it was also like one of the first museums of art and architecture in the city available to the public. And that was because all these, wealthy families were investing a lot in the ornamentation of their monuments. But that doesn't bode well with modern lawn care technology. On the left is an example of monument damage that cannot be repaired. It's just those tiny little nicks. As you can see, the initials, they are not engraved, they're actually embossed, which is very unique. That's not done anymore. That's not a practice that's done anymore, but there has been mower wear and tear on that. And then to the right is also pretty frequent monument damage or disturbance that we see in the grounds. Again, because these monuments, especially in the 19th century lot layouts, are not done symmetrically or geometrically. And so, headstones get knocked over or they get cracked in half, but those can be repaired and are repaired by our restoration department. All right, so let's talk about invasive grasses. So in our current climate, it's a huge challenge to maintain the uniform sward that Strausch was after. So the phenology of, the invasive behavior of some of the warm season grasses that we're seeing, they are out competing all the cool season grasses. So it's obviously creating a weird patchwork of grasses in the lawn, but also the phenology, the life cycles of these grasses is wonky. And what it means is that, they do green up and it's really beautiful in the summer. They do grow really fast, so it does require a lot of mowing and trimming. But during the cool seasons, the dormancy period makes the grounds where these grasses are most predominant look a little weird. All right, so in the face of our changing climate, sort of one of the questions Joe and I always had was, how are we able to build more resilience? Much like the way that we built our resilience or are continuously building the resilience of the living collection, how can we build resilience into lawn management? And it's kind of a two-pronged approach. We want to reduce greenhouse gases, and we are only able to really do that if we increase wildlife habitat. So what do I mean by that? There's many things. So number one, about 12,000 gallons of gasoline has been historically used annually to mow our lawn beast. So this is equivalent to about 240,000 pounds of carbon dioxide each year, which obviously contributes to the problem that is growing. So one of the solutions we had was to convert about 40 acres of Greenwood into a managed meadow. This is just defined really by the number of mows. So instead of being mowed 15 times annually, it's now being mowed between 4 and 6 times. And these areas are largely the public lots. So this is one. This area is called the Hill of Graves. And just reducing the mowing on the 40 acres alone has reduced our total greenhouse gas emissions by 13% just on the mowing operations. But also in this area, there was a bobolink that was sighted and heard singing. This was in 2020, right, Joe? I think it was in 2020.
It was in 2020 and 2021.
Oh, excellent. A repeat, which has not been seen in many decades in New York City. So it's great. It's attracting and supporting more species of wildlife and, attracting more visitors. So like I said, the biggest difference between the public lots and the more modern memorial park-like lots are the headstones. And so the preservation of these headstones has to be approached differently. As you can see here, these headstones are comprised of materials like brownstone, one of the materials that is such a defining feature of New York City architecture, and marble, both of which are, how do I say, just more fragile to being maybe knocked around and beaten up by mowers. So reducing the amount of mowing around them just reduces any potential for impact. All right. So in 2017, Joe, I feel like you should tell this story because you were the one that kept bugging Frank Rossi to come to Greenwood.
So the long and the short of it is, in 2017, we began a multi-year collaboration with Cornell University, specifically the turfgrass extension specialist and assistant professor there, a guy named Dr. Frank Rossi. And we wanted to look at the effects of climate change on what we then called an urban grassland, which is Greenwood. And so we
still call it that.
Right. So
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So real quick, because I just checked time and we don't have much. So this is an area that I've now been focusing on. This is the Memorial Park layout area, and we didn't disrupt any of our operations. We just used this as an opportunity to trial different grass seed mixes, because as I said, the climate of Greenwood has shifted, and the seed mix that was being used and just, sold in the trade was not, it was not able to outcompete the Bermuda grass. So as you can see, these were all the different mixes. We just sort of optimized, honestly, the layout of this area because the headstones so perfectly delineated the tracks of different seed trials. We also did experimental control burning to try and kill and excuse me, kill and mitigate Bermuda grass invasion. This is one of my favorite outcomes. It's very interesting. We did some resurfacing trials. So there were 6 plots that were laid out. Each had different combinations of treatments to test which combination of treatment was most effective at mitigating the reinvasion of Bermuda grass. So the different combinations included either scalping or sod cut into 1-inch depth, an application of chemical herbicide, organic herbicide, or no herbicide application, either compost soil addition or no soil addition, and then every single one of them was hydroseeded. And this trial only lasted 2 years, so this has not been repeated. This has not been peer reviewed. But the preliminary findings were essentially that the combo that was most effective at not only having the grass, the desirable grass establish, and the Bermuda grass very slow to reinvade, was the one that had no chemical inputs and or soil amendments. It was the one that was just sod cut and hydroseeded. So unfortunately, though, this preliminary best practice for mitigating the invasion of Bermuda grass can't be applied everywhere. The sod cutter is really limited in the kind of slope the ground is on, and it has to be level. And as I said before, the topography of Greenwood makes that very challenging. So resurfacing is not just of new graves. It is done on lots that are perpetually endowed or in the perpetual care program, a legacy of Strausch and what he implemented in Spring Grove. So as you can see here, this is a lot that is under perpetual care as it has been defined, which is just defined by short grass eternally. You can see the difference. We mow most of the ground at 4.5 inches. because, as you can see, we want any of the forbs or grasses that are on the ground to come to flower. It supports more of our pollinating insects that way. And here you can see in the perpetual care model, sort of the absence of flowers. And this is a map that shows where all of our perpetual care lots are. And as Frank Rossi, in terms of trying to mitigate the spread or invasion of Bermuda grass, Frank Rossi has said it perfectly in that this is probably death by 1,000 cuts. And I guess I should also explain that Bermuda grass really does propagate and reproduce really well when it likes to be beaten up, right? Like it doesn't just grow by seed, it grows by its rhizomes. It also just will grow by any material that has been chopped off and displaced elsewhere. It is, yeah, it likes a disturbed and a perpetually disturbed landscape. Thrives there. So what does this mean though? We are now rethinking perpetual care to not prioritize lawn, but maybe to be a little more ecologically beneficial. We've been trialing the use of bulbs and other different flower plantings, dare I say gardens, on approved lots. And an example of one of these trials, this is the grave of Frank Wupperman. He played the Wizard of Oz in The Wizard of Oz. And this sort of, path of yellow crocus is an homage to, the yellow brick road that Dorothy traversed to get to him, to go home. It's supposed to be symbolic, guys. So another opportunity that we have found and we are embracing is the more sylvan aesthetic. And we do like, the shade. We do not see the shade as evil. And we in fact do want to like shade the sun out a bit. And we don't always need to plant trees, but we can just let them naturally recolonize in opportune areas like this one. This is a bank near a woodlot on Ocean Hill. We saw some historic images of it earlier, and these banks have been recolonized by sassafras trees. They're beautiful all year round and very technicolor in the autumn. As I'm sure everyone can imagine, there's a lot of vocal dissent to some of these changes, especially the replacement of turf or even, just like the resetting the mowing height higher. And so what we wanted to do is find ways to obviously engage with the public. We collaborated with local artists and activists to, not only consider the lawns and their impacts on, the non-human community, but also us. What are the lawn impacts on us as well? So these are, what you're looking at right now is sort of the installation of what has been called the Lawn Redisturbance Lab. This is the vision of Ellie Irons and Anne Percoco of the next epoch seed library. And I urge you to look up this project because they are essentially looking at urban weeds and the lawn in a very different way through the lens of like the Anthropocene and what it means for the sustainability of us into the future. So in this installation, there are 3 plots, and they were treated differently to showcase how each little tract responded to each intervention. So one was never mowed all year. It was just allowed to grow endlessly. One was mowed the same as the surrounding area. This area in particular is one of our managed meadows. So it was mowed when the meadow was mowed. And then the third one had its turf removed. It was removed by mostly kids from the community to expose the soil bed of which it could rewild. So any seeds that were in the soil bed or seeds that were being dispersed and dropped by the winter birds were allowed to regrow.
Hey, that was that's Ben.
Oh yeah, all right. This is Joe's kid, and that's Joe right there.
Yeah, I was surprised. That's all.
Okay. So when the turf was removed, though, there was a lot of life in the soil, something that most people don't consider. The soil is not dead. And so the kids were able to sort of like interact and collect any of the grubs and other insects that were in there, document them, and then they weren't killed or thrown away. They were just displaced into another location. And so we also just want to keep digging deeper to find ways to support and lead research into our urban ecology. So the work with Cornell University led to the development of what we now are. Has this been instituted? It's been the Greenwood Center for Research. It's still in its infancy, but it is developing.
It developed. We launched our first year of awardees. It's there.
Okay. We just don't have a physical center other than the cemetery. We're building a visitor center soon to come. So we launched this, the grant program that Joe just said. It was 2 different awards, one in urban environmental science and one in human environment interaction. And in fact, the candidates that applied for urban environmental science were so good and so competitive that we actually awarded 2 in that category. And here's just an image of people from Brooklyn College who are describing and mapping the soil. And soils, again, play a huge role in our water and chemical cycles, including the carbon cycle. So there is a growing interest, not only in the scientific community, but also in Greenwood in terms of better understanding excuse me, I've been talking for a long time, understanding how to manage the landscape to achieve and build the soil properties that are more conducive to storing more carbon, keeping carbon in the ground, and also infiltrating more stormwater. And that brings us to a very exciting initiative. We have a stormwater project that is happening, it just started. There's 2-pronged goals of this project. It's to both reduce stormwater runoff and our impact during CSO events, and also to reduce our use of potable water. For those of you who don't live in New York City, the CSO is our combined sewer overflows. Our sewer system is combined literally in that it is designed to collect rainwater, runoff, domestic sewage, and industrial waste, all in the same pipes, and go to the sewage treatment plant before it's discharged. However, during really heavy storm events, like New York City has been experiencing very frequently, this overwhelms the infrastructure. And in fact, all this untreated water waste overflows into not just, the streets of the city, but also into it ends up in New York's coastal systems, which has effect on the wildlife in the coastal system and all that. Needless to say, we are very excited to do this project, to be a part of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Green Innovation Grant Program. Not only does it build infrastructure that helps, preserve and safeguard our community that lies south of us, downstream of us. I've annotated in this graphic that most of the stormwater that falls on Greenwood is discharged, ones that aren't infiltrated into the ground are discharged into the Owl's Head sewer shed, which encompasses almost 30,000 people. But that we are also, really grateful because this will also reduce flooding at Greenwood, which we anticipate happening. And we've already experienced. All right, so finally, I just wanted to end on that Greenwood's history is the story of New York and New Yorkers, and that we will continue its legacy as a space for New Yorkers. The visitor count was actually almost 600,000 in 2020. It was the highest Greenwood has seen since the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century. When there were no large-scale public parks in Manhattan or in Brooklyn. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And Joe, I think you can chime in here, but this is the pandemic was really critical in terms of like us internally reflecting on the value of the space, and especially the relative value as life can change, right? Like a pandemic can happen and all of a sudden people need to be require a little more space, and therefore when public parks might be overcrowded, some of the more overlooked spaces like the rural cemeteries in New York City are being utilized for that same purpose. And so in response to this, rather than restricting access, we increased it. And there's a Robert Pogue Harrison quote. Joe, do you want to read that? So he wrote in 2005, Dominion of the Dead, as long as we think of our cities as merely places to live and not as places to die, they can never truly become our homes.
I love that quote. I love that book. So
I have never read that book, which is why I thought it more apt for you to read it, but it,
I can't see it on my screen, that's all.
Oh, that's why. Yeah, no, it's pretty poignant. And the end. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was amazing. I have to say, well, I appreciate all of the talk. I really appreciate that history in the beginning of really kind of seeing where like this culture of just these lawns in the cemeteries came from. So that was really interesting, as well as seeing how you manage the trees, and then of course the lawns is super sort of near and dear to my heart to sort of remanage and get more biodiversity there. We have a couple of questions. Well, one you answered in the text. Somebody asked, now that you're sort of letting some of these areas grow, are you having problems with ticks? And you say you have no deer ticks there? No,
we don't, thankfully. No deer, so no deer ticks unless they develop the upper body strength to swim across the Verrazano Narrow. But I found a tick on me here. It was a dog tick, and it was probably from offsite. So
yeah, we had the same thing in Central Park. Somebody else also asked, after complimenting what everything looked like, do you guys use fertilizers, and if so, where?
I think it's important to note that the comment was specifically about the Wupperman Road motif.
Oh,
so
that's right.
It's another fan on that list. We use for our turf program, we use a starter fertilizer when we hydro seed, but we largely don't fertilize any areas, perhaps besides putting a dilute Miracle-Gro in some of our planting containers that are in focal points in the cemetery, but that's even moving away. So no, we don't really fertilize.
That's excellent. And we got Molly saying she loves the history of the people and not people at Greenwood. Anybody else have any other questions?
Thank you, Molly.
Nope.
Well, you guys gave us a ton of information. It was all awesome. Again, I loved seeing the history and there were a few Central Park folks in the audience today, and having worked in Central Park and seeing that history, it was fun to see some of the parallels there. But yeah, I do have one more question for you guys. Just very, if you could just tell us really briefly for some of the students in the audience here, how did you get into the work into this kind of work? What's just a little bit about your background?
Sarah, you go ahead. You wanna?
Sure, I'll go first. So I actually started at Greenwood as an intern. I was finishing up my last year at Brooklyn College. I was completing a degree in urban sustainability, actually. It's an interdisciplinary degree that focuses on economics, sociology, and environmental science. And I skewed my concentration in sociology and environmental science. I was brought on to actually digitize the plant records of the living collection. So my path into it was ArcGIS and the Esri system, and then I just continued staying on, doing more projects and stuff like that. Yeah.
She made a nest and.
Yep, and stayed.
We're very fortunate to have Sarah here. So yeah, I also interned here when I was a student at the School of Professional Horticulture at New York Botanical Garden, where Regina, as in fact you were my teacher. I went back to my email and I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, why does her face seem so familiar when we saw each? So it was a great course.
Yeah, one of my early classes that I taught there.
Yeah. I was probably not a great student, but I loved being at the school, and I did my internship here at Greenwood, and then I was hired upon graduation. My route to horticulture was circuitous. I have a master's in English literature. I was on the route to go to medical school, and then I just found myself liking plants a lot, feeling good with working with them. So here I am.
Nice. No, it's always good to know that for the students to know that a circuitous route is mine was very not a straight route also. So so that's always good to know. Somebody had just one last an earlier question when you were talking about the trees and the plantings that you do there. Do you do mostly natives or do you do a mix with the trees?
As an arboretum, we're sort of focused on presenting the breadth of plant material available out there and promoting the preservation of germplasm. But that's just a fancy way of saying that we do plant the majority of native trees now. We also plant some high-performing exotics like, ginkgos and dogwoods. That are not invasive.
Yep.
Yeah, but the sort of composition of our collection does skew non-native, and we have the goal to readjust that. Because I think when people think of biodiversity or just diversity in general, they're just thinking of like species count. But really diversity does encompass how many of each species do you have? Like what is like the total composition and spread of species diversity? So, in this, excuse me, spring planting, it is, largely just like straight native species, ones that are part of what we call our historic core collection. So these are the species that were growing in the wooded lots when, Pierpont acquired the land from the Dutch farmers. And they are also like currently standing our largest trees on site.
Beautiful. I'm putting, for the students that are still on, I'm putting a link in the chat for a survey. If you could take a few minutes to do that before you leave, I'd appreciate that. Any other questions for Sarah and Joe?
Thank you all for spending Wednesday night with us.
Yeah, also Zamira, I also realize every day that there's more to
Okay.
learn. So yeah.
That is very
Yes.
true.
It's really understanding. I just understood, like, because we just see as a grave, but there is more to the environment and how the effects on the wildlife and how much we can change towards it. I'm growing up in a tropical country. Never looked at a graveyard as in this point of view. Just it's in a wildlife where or nobody goes there most of the time. So it's really nice to learn about it, how it can impact future society too.
I definitely agree with you. I just want to end on this note and then we can end it. But like one of the more striking things I was constantly thinking about in school is how to increase the number of functions of a place, and sort of like that increase in functioning just like builds resilience in for like the community, what it's used for, everything else. So yeah.
That's a great point, and we could it's a good point to carry to all different types of landscapes and just really kind of try and snowball this so that it happens in enough areas that it makes a really huge difference.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I got back here. But I was wondering, I've been doing a lot of, with help of Dr. Alvarez, I've been doing a lot of native planting in my yard. And one of the things that I had done some investigation with Cornell Extension was planting clover.
Mm-hmm.
And was that something you even considered, or was it too difficult, or it just doesn't work?
We didn't need to plant clover. It's everywhere. It's like everywhere. Yeah. So it's really interesting because clover, you know, historically has always just been treated as a weed, and you know, herbicide was used to kill it. And it would seem that herbicide is not doing it, or wasn't doing its job at Greenwood. Like the moment we raised the height of cut and stopped mowing, we were just seeing the proliferation of clover everywhere. And actually, in terms of the sort of mitigation of Bermuda grass and other warm season grasses, clover actually does a really good job of like not letting Bermuda grass outcompete it. But yeah, no, clover is great. It's a nitrogen fixer.
It has so many positive.
It does, yeah.
So
and it also like smells good.
I actually went to Greenwood Cemetery on a request of my cousin out in California, because we have my great grandfather's buried there for 1905, and of course,
oh wow,
there was no headstone. It was gone. They must have had a limestone headstone type of thing. But I took a picture of where it should have been and sent it to her, and she put it on Find a Grave site. But I think it's a magnificent, if any of the students would ever want to travel, it's such a magnificent area. I never thought of how big and how beautiful the landscape was, and now I have even a greater appreciation after listening to the talk. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And just
You
to
guys do a
note,
great job. Really
thank
great.
you. Thank you, Madeline. And just to note on your grandfather or great grandfather's headstone, it is likely there if it ever did exist. It's probably just sunk in and now in the soil, which according to our director of preservation is one of the best places these headstones can be. They will be preserved in the soil. And also she is constantly going and, you know, erecting, uninterring these sunken stones and resetting them. So
Oh, wow. I didn't
she
know
will,
that.
yeah, so she will eventually get, she only has a crew of, it's just herself and 2 other staff members. And we have, oh boy, it's like 200,000 monuments at Greenwood. So it's
Yeah.
slow and steady pace. Yeah.
Very, very beautiful though. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you again, Sarah and Joseph. We really, really appreciate you coming and giving us this great talk. And maybe we'll schedule, Madeline will schedule a field trip out there with some of the students at some
Love
point.
to host.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that would
definitely.
be
Sounds like
great.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I appreciate you you joining us tonight, and we'll see you at the next one next month. So
Thank you,
again.
Regina.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
thank you.
everybody.
Well,
Thank
thank
Have a
you.
good
Dr.
night.
Ellis.
Bye bye.
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 Buddy.